This is the Latin News Podcast, episode 5. I'm Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. My very special guest this week is Dr. Emily Morris. She's the research fellow at UCL, Institute of the Americas. She's an expert on Cuba and economic policy and so much more when it comes to that island in the Caribbean. And that's what we'll be discussing today, because there's been all sorts of goings on, and we need to go over them to clarify to our listeners and all of you out there, of course, what is next for Cuba. So, Emily, thank you so much for your time coming on the Latin News Podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really interesting to come back here after 10 years after the article I wrote on the exchange rate and rereading it and thinking about what's happened in the last decade. So yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks.
Well, it's a fascinating article. I mean, it's a fascinating article that you wrote all those years ago on the dual currency system in Cuba and why it needed to change. And when I was reading back through it, I found it remarkably prescient as what happened. I mean, you really did predict the future over those 10 years. So perhaps we could start with the very basics and say, what was this dual currency system?
Okay, well, yeah, the dual currency system emerged in the well, there was always a dual currency in that there was always a black market rate. But the black market rate before the collapse of the Soviet Union was something like 7-1. So the official rate was 1 Cuban peso to 1 US dollar, which was equal then under the Soviet system to 1 ruble or whatever, it was fixed. And then it was around 7-1 when the Soviet Union collapsed, or when the Soviet bloc collapsed. And during the economic crisis that ensued, because of the shortages that occurred, huge amounts of shortages and a very large fiscal deficit, so the exchange rate collapsed to around 120-1. That was on the black markets. And so this was effectively runaway inflation as well, because of course, what people had to pay to get goods outside of what was available in the state rations became enormous in peso terms, completely unaffordable and so on. So in the middle of the 1990s, they had a stabilization strategy, which they never called stabilization strategy, but it was a stabilization, and they cut the fiscal deficit enormously, and they created these two exchange rates. Mm-hmm. So there was the market rate, and then there was the official rate, which was still used for state enterprises. Now, this is the strange thing. So state enterprises were using 1-1, whereas people for their personal transactions could use a rate that was floating and market determined. The market settled down around 24-1 on what they call the Cadeca rate. So it was legal, it was market determined, but it was a secondary rate. So that kind of, there were some changes between then and when I was writing, but broadly that's what remained how the system worked. Mm-hmm. Initially, the convertible peso was circulating alongside the US dollar, then they withdrew the US dollar from circulation, so you had this kind of proxy US dollar. So it was complicated, but it was that was what people got used to, is 24-1.
24-1, an increase from 7-1.
Yeah, well, it had first gone from 7 to 120, and then with the stabilization, improved actually to. Okay. That was actually quite unusual among post-Soviet economies, for actually to get an appreciation after the depreciation. And that's partly because so many of the prices in the economy were fixed, and so you had a kind of an anchor that brought it back down again. So that's what happened before I wrote the article. So there were two exchange rates, and there was a lot of discussion about what had caused, what this dual exchange rate system was doing to the economy. It was enormously damaging. It meant that people who had access to US dollars through the growing tourism market were much, much richer than other people. It distorted every aspect of economic life. So in the public sector, it meant that state enterprises were underestimating the cost of imports relative to what they'd earned from exports. And therefore it was creating all sorts of inefficiencies. Well, right the way through, distortions. And in the private sector, it meant that a lot of people in the private sector were being paid minuscule wages in dollars terms, which got magnified when you did the exchange rate. And so they could actually buy things which are in controlled prices at 24-1, and then they didn't have to earn very much in order to be richer than somebody who was on the state salary. So that also meant that people who were working for the state in whatever capacity, in manufacturing or in teaching or whatever, would be leaving those professions in droves. So they had a real internal brain drain. Qualified people would be moving into unqualified or unskilled work in the dollar earning sector, which is mainly linked to tourism. So that was, the economy was extremely distorted. The continual efforts to increase exports and increase import substitution would always fail under those circumstances. They could not lift the economy into a externally stimulated export-driven economy when you've got that degree of distortion. And so that's why at the time I said why this must change, because the longer this went on, the more entrenched, every day that passed, there'd be another Cuban making a decision about how they made their living, leaving the state sector. All of that training that they had through the universal free education system was just squandered. They just lost it. And the new private sector, which was growing rapidly even then, was growing in a very distorted way. It was growing at very low productivity, which was not a good thing in the long term, because once you move to a more, market-driven prices, which you needed to have, a lot of that new private sector wouldn't be viable. So that's why I was saying it was really urgent to be done at that time. And that was 10 years ago. And so then the question is, what did they do between, after that? Why didn't they do anything? And they had stated in public policy that the unification of the exchange rate was one of the 300 priorities. I mean, they have a bit of a habit of doing official documents that say these are our priorities, but the priorities aren't ranked in any order, so everything is a priority. And there was a major document produced in 2011 called the Lineamientos, Guidelines for Economic Policy. And this was, I remember, Lineamiento number 56 was exchange rate unification. And so it just sat there, and everybody on the street was saying, what the hell's going on? This should be happening. And I looked at the date that I wrote that report, and I realized now that there were things happening that people didn't know about at the time. So there were various commissions, people exploring how they're going to move from their existing system to the new system. And what I did say in the article, thanks for saying it was prescient, but it would be destabilizing, whatever you did, however you did. If you change prices and exchange rates throughout the economy, it is destabilizing, and there would be winners and losers. So they, aware of that, they had all these people in the ministries trying to work out what to do. They were now, at that time, starting these negotiations in secret with the Obama administration. So they were hoping for an opening up. They were also, and Raul Castro had been saying for a while that they needed to sort out their outstanding debt issues with the London Club. So they were preparing for that. So when in 2014, at the end of 2014, they announced the re-establishment of diplomatic relations, within a year, they also had an agreement with the Paris Club. The Paris Club is what I mean, not the London Club yet. And so they, so that was all going on. And I had seen an inkling of that, because you could see that what was happening actually since 2009 was the balance between the level of import spending, or the spending on the current account of foreign exchange, was less than what they were bringing in. And so they were beginning to build reserves. They were beginning to get ready for repaying debt. So that was going on. The Cubans don't ever publish their level of international reserves. So for years, I've been following, what are the inflows, what are the outflows? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? And that was a strange thing that was happening in those years. It was very clear that that was going on. So during the Obama opening, that initially that process was continuing strongly. So the official GDP growth rate was very low, even though there seemed to be, the economy seemed to be picking up. Mm-hmm. Particularly the private sector. And people were feeling it. They were feeling it in their pockets. They were feeling it in terms of the possibilities of life and all the rest of it. So why didn't they make the move at that moment? See, so just a year or so after I wrote that report, that was possibly their best opportunity during the Obama opening. But they were also continuing to try to rebuild reserves, trying to pay the debt, and cautious. They didn't know how long this was going to last, and so on. Mm-hmm. And they were still working on what to do, how to do it, how to manage this thing. So that sluggishness, I think, is probably the only opportunity that they had, because then that opening only lasted for 2 years, 2015 to 17. And then the situation in the US changed. So it would have been very surprising if they'd have gone ahead with it during the Trump administration, because the Trump administration was introducing a series, one after the other, of measures to try to limit Cuba's foreign exchange and to make things more difficult economically. So in a way, it's not surprising they didn't do it then, but they kept working on it and they were still thinking about it. And then when they finally did it, and again, this is not a coincidence, they finally, in November 2020, that was a very interesting year, as we know, that the sanctions have been tightening since 2019. Their oil deliveries had been interrupted by one of the measures taken by the Trump administration, and they'd had COVID. So they had a difficult year. They'd had a severe lockdown. They'd had cases of COVID, but they had actually managed the COVID very, very well. Compared to all the countries in the region, they were doing extraordinarily well. So I suppose they felt, they were in a good position. And I suppose, and I'm guessing completely now, like the rest of the world, they thought that Biden meant it when he said he was going to revert to the Obama position on Cuba. And so instead of that, what happened is, so in December, they increased wages in anticipation of the inflation that would inevitably follow. There would have to be price adjustments. So wages were increased by 3-4-fold. I mean, huge. And people felt quite happy about that. And, in the immediate, very short term, they felt better off. And then came January, and 9 days before he stepped down, before Trump stepped down, they introduced their final measure, which was adding Cuba back onto the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And the impact of that wasn't immediate, but was probably more severe than anything else that they'd introduced. And so that happened, and then Omicron happened, because the Cubans then opened up a little bit, feeling a bit more confident about COVID. And then the Omicron variant happened. The Cubans were working on their vaccine, but it was a race against time that they kind of lost. And so you see the takeoff of COVID during that period. So you have a sudden reduction. There was also an increase in, the deliveries didn't arrive because contracts would be cancelled, because suppliers wouldn't want to deal with Cuba because it was included on the state sponsors of terrorism list. So there were non-deliveries. there was the outbreak of COVID. Inflation took off like anything because they always expected there would be inflation, but with supply shock as well at the same time, the inflation was stronger than they had anticipated. The exchange rate, the black market exchange rate re-emerged. So the unification was on January the 1st, 2021, and it was at 24-1, which was the same existing rate that there was already on the Cadeca, the informal rate. But it meant that all state enterprises had to adjust their prices. So all of those prices went up, and then all the black market prices and all the informal economy prices and all the market economy prices also went up. So by July, the Cubans, who'd hardly experienced any inflation in their lifetime in terms of state prices and so on, suddenly found they didn't know when this was going to stop. So the feeling of insecurity, the feeling of shock, and the frustration built up of COVID lockdowns and all the rest of it, and food shortages and queues, everybody was at their wits' end. I mean, the degree of, say, irritation, frustration, anger, even at their neighbors, let alone at the government. I mean, everybody was in a very highly strung state by July. So that's when the explosion happened, the biggest riots that they'd ever had, the bigger demonstrations and so on. And so inflation, so that's where they came to that. That was really the low point politically in terms of COVID, because then just about at that moment they were starting to roll out the vaccine. By October, COVID had receded. There were some more calls for demonstrations in November, but they came to nothing. So it was, a beginning of a kind of sense of maybe things will stabilize. So since that time, now that's 2 years ago now, you've continued to have inflation. You've had, in the last year, in 2022, wages rose 10%, prices, but it's very difficult to measure inflation in Cuba, but there's an official rate which bears very little responsibility to anybody's experience. And then you've got just the cost of living and the perceived increase in prices, which is seems to be often done on the price of pork. So before New Year, it spikes. But so they're still experiencing inflation. They're still experiencing very little change in US sanctions. And all of this comes after that moment of kind of optimism and improvement and expectation under Obama. And then you had the 4 years of Trump, and then you had now with Biden, no change. So it's really, I think, absolutely no surprise that people are leaving, and they're leaving in droves now.
Yes.
The situation hasn't got any better. The rationed goods kind of arrive enough to keep people alive, but they're spending their lives in queues. And now they've also got difficulties with the power system and blackouts and so on. So it's very, very tough at the moment.
So I wanted to jump in there on that. If we go back, it's economy, cost of living. Obviously, tourism hasn't fully recovered. The July 2021 protest, which seemed, immense in their size, really, for Cuba. Obviously, the pandemic, food shortages, the ordinary Cuban suffering immensely. But at the same time, these blackouts, can we relate it to the fuel shortages coming through from Venezuela?
Yeah, you can see in the import figures that there's been, to some extent, a switch away from Venezuela hasn't been supplying as much of Cuba's oil as before. They've been finding other sources, but there are restrictions. There are huge problems because one of the many sanctions says that any tanker that's insured by a US insurer is not permitted to take oil to Cuba. So that's one thing, that's a direct one. But then there's another one of any kind of payments paid in US dollars, and oil is usually paid in US dollars. Anybody who receives that payments from Cuba for that is also frightened of US sanctions, even if they wouldn't apply, even if it's a third country. What they call over-compliance is a huge issue. So the Cubans, and I did an interview with somebody from the Ministry of the Economy last November, and she was just quite low down in the ministry, but she was just describing how, they have less money because they have less foreign exchange. The oil price has gone up, and then they managed to get somebody to do the supply, and then they cancel at the last minute. And so you have not only less money to buy in oil, but you also have the unpredictability of deliveries. And then, of course, within Cuba, you had the problems with distribution within Cuba, because they're not having vehicles or whatever to distribute the oil within the country, because everything's broken. That's what happens if you have several years of no foreign exchange. You don't have spare tires. You don't fix things. So so this kind of unpredictability, I think, is an important factor in a way. Is like the Cuban state assumes a responsibility for making sure that everybody's got enough food, but they're unable to deliver because they can't actually plan properly. They can't actually plan ahead. And so they're living hand to mouth, emergency all the time, trying to get things into the right place. The fuel one is another one. So it's fuel. They haven't got enough fuel. They haven't got enough fuel at the right time in the right place. Their power stations are regularly breaking down because they're in a sorry state. And so you've got the combination of all of those things means that, and then of course they had an enormous fire in one of their fuel storage places. And so, just adding to the general sort of litany of disasters, they've had that happening as well.
This is, you sort of reflect on how positive things were going in that Obama administration, and the Cubans seeing perhaps a more positive future, and then being completely tipped off a precipice. And it ran and ran, and it continues to run, this malaise, obviously not just political, but in every sector of society, and every topic we have touched on. And I think we peg this now to Diaz-Canel being reelected in April. Of course, he gained a majority, but low turnouts. And I think this obviously reflects Cuba's, as you say, the uncertainty, instability, mistrust, I imagine, and just basic rage. Can we say that?
I think it's more loss of hope. It's just despair rather than rage. Some people can, clearly, but it's very difficult to be furious with an administration. Diaz-Canel himself he's total contrast to his predecessors. He's not a charismatic person. He is stolid, hardworking, traipsing around the country, trying to talk to people, trying to understand, trying to say that they're doing something, but also trying to explain that there's very little they can do. So he's kind of hapless figure, really. I think, and so he doesn't inspire confidence because he doesn't sort of project an idea of hope. They're trying to, use what they have. They're trying to come to terms with the fact that they can't rely on a US opening. This is what's going on in terms of economic policy, is that they now have come to the conclusion, I think, policy-wise, that whatever their strategy is too far. And that kind of explains what's going on in terms of foreign policy or the people that they've got visiting and the tours that they're doing. So Cuba is re-establishing apparently very friendly relations with Russia. Now, of course, there's no ideological affinity between them whatsoever, but except a lot of Cubans of the older generation could speak Russian, they've been to Russia. So it's possible to kind of construct a kind of friendliness between them, but culturally, politically, ideologically, even economically, they're miles apart. But it's very interesting to watch that happening in the past few weeks. So the Russians are talking very friendlily. They're going to provide some kind of financing, which is what Cuba needs more than anything else. The Cubans can't get it from anywhere else because of the state-sponsored terrorism thing. So now they're being kind of forced into a relationship, which is an uncomfortable one, I think. It has to be said. But they're also at the same time working very closely with the Chinese. They've always been very good friends with the Vietnamese. So that continues. They have good, strong relations with all of the Caribbean countries and with CARICOM, and building better relations with Latin America after a kind of period of more difficulties. And then, of course, they've got the EU. So what they're trying to do is to kind of, to maintain relations, a wide range of relations. But the one that would obviously catch the attention of the US at the moment is the relationship with Russia. And I get the impression that Cubans are kind of quite enjoying, accentuating that part of it. What it'll produce in real terms is, more difficult to see, because the Russian private sector is going over there trying to get a good deal, and the Cubans are not giving up their process of vetting investors. So, and it was quite interesting because the Russians said, yes, and we're talking about reducing the bureaucracy. And you think that bureaucracy is actually the kind of due diligence on the Cuban side. So that's a kind of it would be interesting to watch in concrete terms what happens with Russian investment in Cuba over the next year or so. Anyway, so that's what's happening now. And I don't know whether that's going to persuade anybody in the US that it's maybe not wise to isolate Cuba in that way, or to cut off relations with Cuba, because what they're doing is they're creating what they had in the Cold War. The Russians as a neighbor.
This is a fascinating prospect, concerning, of course, and of course, I'm sure it's being looked at with some interest by the government of President Biden, and of course, people like Ron DeSantis as well will be very aware from his base in Florida. But do you feel then, and as we sort of wind this down, do you feel that in order for the US and the government of President Joe Biden to address, let's say, the Cuba dilemma, they're going to need some suggestions from Diaz-Canel of meaningful political reform on the island?
That's an interesting question. It's like, who's going to move first? The Cubans have actually in 2021, the worst. They moved ahead with the opening up of 2022. To private enterprises. So they had, you could be self-employed before, so there were small enterprises. They've now taken away that. So large enterprises, private enterprises are now possible in Cuba. And those private enterprises can also, if they can find anybody who will give them finance from abroad, can use external finance. And so this is a really, really fundamental reform. I mean, it's huge, but obviously that sector's not growing as fast as it could be because it has no finance. And the Cuban financial system neither has no resources nor the skills, if you like, the capacity to fill that gap. But so reforms are continuing. So then the question is, the people who the US is saying they need a gesture, and in terms of releasing what they call political prisoners, what the Cubans call people who rioted. And so, so where in the past, those kind of releases have always been mediated through the church or some other kind of organization. It wasn't a coincidence that when they opened to Obama, there were a lot of prisoner releases. But the Cubans said it wasn't at the behest of the US because it's their own domestic, personal, thing. They don't tell the US to release their prisoners. The US can't tell them to release their prisoners. So in principle, the Cubans say, no, we don't do anything under duress. The sanctions are unilateral sanctions imposed by the US and that they have no right to do. The Cubans won't make concessions. On the other hand, when they start talking, things do happen. Yeah. And that is quite clear from when, there's a precedent for that. Once they have diplomatic relations restored under Obama, there were a whole load of commissions got created and they started to move forward on lots of different fronts. So the question is, how do you begin this process? And I don't think that if Biden thinks he can just shout across the sea, you have to do that, you have to do that, otherwise we won't move, it's going to have any impact at all. The Cubans will not move under those circumstances, and the US diplomatic people must know that. They're already in discussions about, strangely, about anti-terrorism because they collaborate in that area. They collaborate on migration, on drugs, and anti-terrorism. So all of that, they actually, in the security services, the last thing they want is instability in Cuba because Cuba's their strongest ally in the region. So it's a kind of a very contradictory thing. Cuba is no threat at all to the US. But politically, you're quite right. Politically, you're quite right because the people who insist on maintaining and strengthening sanctions demand that there must be some concessions on the Cuban side. And a lot of those people are very well placed on various commissions, on congressional commissions, that are able to block anything, so many things that Biden might want to do in other areas. Cuba's simply not worth it for him. So it's not, I don't believe that it's actually a matter of if the Cubans made concessions, the US would make concessions. I think if Cubans made concessions, they would actually never be enough for those people. Yeah. Whatever they did, they'd find another reason. And the Cubans, that's the experience. That's what they've experienced in the past. So I think it's a funny way, it's a way that the discussion has been framed in the US, but it's not actually a useful way of framing the question. If they want to move ahead, they'll need to move away from what the Cubans describe, very similar to what the US is saying about China at the moment. This is economic coercion. Very strong, a weapon used very strongly, but it doesn't achieve anything as in terms of their aims.
So how, we've gone through this, we've gone through the peak, the trough, and now what's continuing. How do you feel about the coming months, the immediate future for Cuba?
I don't think, and actually nobody I spoke to in Cuba at any level, in any department, thought that there was going to be a quick escape from this. These difficulties are going to persist. I did say, I have suggested that they may be in the trough at the moment. And tourism will pick up. They're getting a little bit of finance from Russia, from China, from various places. Tiny bits of finance compared to other places, but at least it's some. But even as they pick up, even as those things recover, it does remain a priority for Cuba, which people find surprising, to service the debt. And that is going to be expensive. It's going to hold back the recovery of living standards. So the private sector is certainly growing. There's more happening there. There are some improvements in efficiency in the state sector in terms of administrative efficiency. And the kind of application of information technology, communications is improving. It's a slow process, though, And in the meantime, it's like a safety valve. The young people just go abroad rather than protesting. But you have this kind of hemorrhaging of their talent, which is serious in so many areas, not just in higher education, but even in, electrical. So, again, they're in a situation again, until they can get a strong enough economic recovery, the damage is continuing. And so kind of structural damage, saying to kind of stem that erosion of capacity. So it would be several years before anybody, and still aren't coming from some places because of problems with insurance and so on, because of the state sponsors of terrorism. I mean, that would be actually I suppose the thing that could accelerate the recovery could be removing from that list, which actually has no justification.
Well, it's certainly bleak right now, but not the end.
Rather discredits their terrorism. Yeah. I mean, there have been so many predictions of there being an end. Things are terrible at the moment, and but trying to see how the end would come about. I don't feel that there's a rage and anger on that level. There's a frustration, but there is a kind of sense of kind of limping through this awful period that they have, and which is continuing. I may be wrong. Because levels of frustration, you never know when they're going to boil over. But it doesn't feel like that at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I mean, so very interesting to discuss Cuba with such prodigious knowledge, because honestly, what we receive in the press is not it's not what we're hearing from you. You've been able to give us a very profound look at what's going on in Cuba, and I know that you're heading off there shortly, so we hope to hear more about your almost your observations of the country in coming months. So, and let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Dr. Emily Morris, who is a research fellow at UCL's Institute of the Americas, expert in all things Cuba. Thank you so much for your time, for being on the Latin News podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It has been an absolute pleasure. This has been episode 5 of the Latin News Podcast. Just check out our website, thelatinNewspodcast.com, and you can find all the links to the various places to listen to this podcast or view it on YouTube. Thank you again. I've been Richard McCall here in Bogota, Colombia, and goodbye.